It is 1933. Germany is broke. 6 million people are unemployed. That is nearly 1 in 3 working adults with no job, no income, and no hope. Soup kitchens line the streets of Berlin. Families are burning furniture for heat. The currency had already collapsed once in 1923, when a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, and the trauma of that hyperinflation is still fresh in everyone's mind. The government is barely functioning. Democracy is collapsing. And a man who was considered a joke 5 years ago has just been handed the keys to the country. His name is Adolf Hitler. And in 6 years, he will turn this bankrupt, broken nation into the most powerful military machine Europe has ever seen. Unemployment will drop to nearly zero. Factories will be roaring. A brand new highway system will be under construction. And the German military, which was banned from having more than 100,000 soldiers under the Treaty of Versailles, will have millions of them, backed by thousands of tanks, warships, and aircraft. This is the entire story of the Nazi economy, how it was built, how it was faked, how it conquered, how it enslaved, and how it collapsed into the most complete economic destruction in modern history. If you are new here, subscribe for more stories like this. So how does a country go from breadlines to blitzkrieg in 6 years? The short answer is, they cheated. The long answer is more interesting. When Hitler took power on the 30th of January 1933, the German economy was already showing faint signs of recovery. A public works program had been created under the previous Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, and about 2 million jobs had already been created by the summer of 1933. Hitler took credit for every single one of them. But the Nazis did add their own programs. They launched massive infrastructure projects. The most famous was the Autobahn, the new highway network that Nazi propaganda plastered across every newsreel. They poured money into housing, into public buildings, into land reclamation. And they did something very clever with the unemployment numbers. Starting in July 1933, they stopped counting people in government work programs as unemployed. They removed women from the workforce and told them to go home and have children. They expelled Jews from their jobs and gave those jobs to non-Jewish Germans. The numbers looked incredible. Unemployment dropped from 6 million to 1 million by 1937. But the real engine behind all of it was rearmament, and rearmament was illegal. The Treaty of Versailles, signed after the First World War, had stripped Germany of its military. The army was capped at 100,000 men, no air force, no submarines, no tanks. Germany was supposed to stay weak, forever. Hitler had no intention of following those rules. The problem was money. You cannot build an army in secret if the spending shows up on the national budget for everyone to see. Enter Hjalmar Schacht. He was the president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, and he was arguably the most important man in the Nazi regime that most people have never heard of. Schacht was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a banker. A brilliant, ruthless, amoral banker who believed Germany needed to be restored to greatness, and he did not much care how. Schacht invented a scheme so audacious that a Nuremberg prosecutor later called it a swindle on a national scale with no precedent. He created a shell company called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Mefo. The company had no employees, no products, no office. It existed purely on paper, but it could issue bills of exchange, basically IOUs, to arms manufacturers. Krupp, Siemens, Rheinmetall, and others would deliver weapons to the German military and get paid in Mefo bills instead of cash. Those bills were guaranteed by the government and could be cashed at any bank. The banks accepted them because the Reichsbank promised to cover them. It was, in effect, printing money without calling it printing money. And the total amount outstanding was classified as a state secret. By the time the program ended in 1938, 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills had been issued. That covered roughly 60% of Germany's entire rearmament spending. The Reichsbank was legally limited to lending the government 100 million marks. Schacht found a way around that by a factor of 120, and it worked. By 1935, Hitler openly announced rearmament to the world. The Allies protested. They did nothing. By 1936, military spending accounted for nearly a quarter of Germany's entire GDP. Factories were running around the clock producing tanks, artillery, aircraft, and warships. The German economy was not recovering. It was being converted into a war machine, and the German people, most of them, loved it. But it was a house of cards. Here is the problem that nobody talks about. The Nazi economic miracle was never sustainable. Germany lacked the raw materials to be self-sufficient. It needed to import iron ore, rubber, oil, and dozens of other resources. To import those things, it needed foreign currency. Foreign currency was running out because the government was spending everything on guns instead of goods it could export. Schacht knew this. He warned Hitler repeatedly that the economy was overheating, that the Mefo bills were a ticking time bomb, and that the whole thing would collapse if they didn't slow down. Hitler did not want to slow down. In 1936, he announced a 4-year plan under Hermann Göring that pushed the economy even harder toward total war readiness. Schacht was sidelined. He resigned as economics minister in 1937 and was removed as Reichsbank president in 1939. The man who built the machine was thrown out of it because he told the truth about what the machine was doing. And this is the part of the story where the Nazi economy stops being clever and starts being criminal. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, it was not just a military decision. It was an economic decision. Germany needed resources it could not buy, so it decided to take them. Every country the Wehrmacht conquered was immediately looted. Gold reserves, factory equipment, raw materials, food, livestock, everything was shipped back to Germany. The occupation of France alone gave Germany access to enormous industrial capacity. The Nazis forced occupied nations to pay for their own occupation through so-called contribution payments that drained their economies. But the most important resource the Nazis stole was people. As the war expanded and millions of German men were sent to the front, the civilian workforce shrank dramatically, from 39 million in 1939 to 29 million by 1944. Somebody had to run the factories. The Nazi answer was forced labor on a scale the world had never seen. Over the course of the war, approximately 12 million people were kidnapped from occupied countries and forced to work in Germany. By the summer of 1944, 7.5 million foreign workers and prisoners of war were working inside the Reich. They made up 20% of the entire workforce. In the munitions industry, the number was closer to a third. These were not abstract statistics. These were human beings. Polish teenagers dragged from their families, Soviet civilians loaded onto cattle cars, French workers deported under threat of death, concentration camp prisoners rented out to German corporations, Krupp, IG Farben, Siemens, Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, and worked until they dropped. By 1944, slave labor made up 1/4 of Germany's entire civilian workforce, and the majority of German factories had a contingent of prisoners. This was the real Nazi economy, not the propaganda reels of shiny highways and happy workers. The real economy ran on theft and slavery, and even that was not enough. Albert Speer, who became Minister of Armaments in 1942, managed to squeeze more production out of the system by rationalizing manufacturing and extending working hours. German weapons production actually peaked in the summer of 1944. But by then, it did not matter. The Allies were producing more of everything. The United States alone outproduced Germany in virtually every category. The Soviets outproduced them in tanks and artillery. Even Britain outproduced Germany in several key areas. And then the bombs came. From late 1944 onward, Allied bombing campaigns systematically destroyed what was left of the German economy. Synthetic fuel production dropped 86% in 8 months. Explosives output fell by 42%. Tank production collapsed by 35%. Rail networks were shattered. Factories lay in rubble. Between 200,000 and 300,000 workers were permanently pulled off production lines just to repair oil installations. By the spring of 1945, the German economy had ceased to exist. The currency was worthless. The Reichsmark was still technically in circulation, but nobody wanted it. a vast monetary overhang, estimated at 10 times the normal money supply, was propped up only by a price freeze that Hitler had imposed back in 1936. The black market became the real economy. Cigarettes were more valuable than banknotes. Butter cost more than gold. This was Stunde Null, 0 hour, the moment Germany hit absolute bottom. Every major city was in ruins. 80% of Cologne was destroyed. 90% of the center of Dresden was gone. Berlin was unrecognizable. 20 million Germans were homeless. Industrial production had fallen to a fraction of its pre-war level. There was no functioning government, no banking system, no supply chain. People were starving. And then something remarkable happened. In 1947, the United States launched the Marshall Plan and pumped $13 billion, roughly $170 billion in today's money, into Western Europe. West Germany received about $1.5 billion of it. A currency reform in 1948 replaced the worthless Reichsmark with the new Deutsche Mark overnight, wiping out savings, ending the black market, and stabilizing prices almost immediately. Ludwig Erhard, the new economics director, lifted price controls and let the market function again. The result was the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The real one this time. Within a decade, West Germany went from rubble to one of the fastest-growing economies on the planet. By the mid-1950s, it was an industrial powerhouse again. By the 1960s, it was the strongest economy in Europe. Hjalmar Schacht, the man who had invented the financial tricks that made the Nazi war machine possible, was tried at Nuremberg. He was acquitted of war crimes. He was sentenced to 8 years by a German denazification court. He was released early in 1948. He started a new bank in Dusseldorf, wrote a book called The Magic of Money, and died in 1970 at the age of 93. He never expressed regret. So here's the paradox of the Nazi economy. It looked like a miracle, but it was a Ponzi scheme backed by a printing press and powered by slave labor. It lifted a nation out of depression, but only by steering it directly into the most destructive war in human history. The 6 million jobs it created led to 60 million deaths. The factories it built were bombed into dust. The currency it printed became worthless, and the country it was supposed to make great was split in two for the next 45 years. The Nazi economy was not a miracle. It was a robbery that set the world on fire. Subscribe for more videos like this one. See you next time.